Hey, thanks for joining me on another action-packed rock extravaganza, this time coming to you from Glendo State Park here in eastern Wyoming. This is part of a series of videos I've done while I'm out here. I drove from Texas to Wyoming, took a day and a half. It's a long drive with a whole lot of, frankly, not very interesting scenery until you start getting into Colorado and Wyoming. But I made it here, safe and sound, lost a couple of parts off the camper, but that's a whole nother story. I've been doing some fishing, camping, looking at rocks, and you might wonder why it's called the Red Hills Campground. Or maybe you don't wonder, but you're about to find out anyway. That's why it's called the Red Hills Campground. Behind me, and extending all along the shoreline of Glendo Reservoir, in a couple of miles direction north and a couple of miles to the south, is what's called the Goose Egg Formation. And the Goose Egg is a really interesting unit. We're going to spend a little time looking at the sedimentology, the trace fossils, or lack thereof, and find out a little bit more about it. It's a Permian to Triassic, early Triassic unit. There's been a lot of interesting research done on it recently. It's been pretty neglected for a number of decades, but recently a couple of people have gotten interested in it. We'll talk more about that too. It's a unit not only of geological interest, but of cultural interest, archaeological interest, and even the mining industry, which actually started around 13,000 years ago. We'll talk about that out on the rocks. We're going to go onto the reservoir, going to take the boat out, look at some outcrops. So in the meantime, let's go dump in the boat, look at some rocks, and I'll see you on the water. So we're going to look around at some of the blocks here because there's all kinds of interesting things on the ground. There's a lot of talus. You can learn a lot from talus. We're going to look at some of that. We're going to look at some of the bedding in place material and see what we can say about it. See this texture on this talus slope block here? This is the bedding plane. That's the bedding plane. At first they look like mud cracks, but they're very irregular. They go really deep and they kind of sort of just don't have a distinct mud crack appearance. And in fact, when we look at other sections of talus block, they all seem to have that texture. This sort of wrinkly texture is pretty typical of carbonates. That's how they weather. So we seem to be in a carbonate environment, which doesn't necessarily mean marine. And we'll explore a little bit further up the hill. We'll see some of that red ochre material and give some thoughts on what it might be. So the slope of red material doesn't really crop out too well, but fortunately, there's big blocks we can look at. So we'll take a look at some of them and see what the facies are inside. We'll start with this one right here. It's coarse grained. There's empty holes where there used to be large clasts of probably material like this, probably stuff like this. So it seems like a conglomerate. This is a sand. I've already tasted it. Look at this. Here's some of those clasts. So sandstone clasts. There was sandstone that was being re-eroded by these systems. That's typical of a fluvial. Oh yeah, take a look at this. Big clasts, big cobbles and pebbles in this, what looks like a pretty massive chunk of material, like a typical debris flow. You know, you not only find them in fluvial systems, you find them anywhere you get a lot of material. So in alluvial fans, deep water deposits, shallow water deposits, you just need a lot of sediment mobilizing really rapidly with water and squirting into an environment. So that's what this looks like. So some of this red bed material is that. All right, at our last stop, we were in the lower part of the Goose Egg Formation, and that's probably Permian, Pennsylvania Permian. Now we've moved up into the Triassic. So the Goose Egg goes into the early Triassic. And we're going to take a look at this stuff in up close and gory detail in a second. This is the view of the other side of the bay that I'm in. And you can see it's a lot more laminated. There's a lot more stratigraphic regularity to it than there was at the last stop. So back there was that big chunky carbonate material that had some lamination in it. And then there was this sort of blocky amorphous conglomerate. This looks like there's a lot more platey stuff and a lot more horizontal stratification. So we'll see what it's all about in a second. This is so cool. I just found the smallest ripples in the world. Look at these little bitty guys. Tiny little ripples. They're all over the place here. Look at this. That is super cute. Tiny little ripples. This whole beach is covered in this platey sandstone facies, which is a new one we haven't seen. And on it are these awesome, awesome little bitty ripples, little cute ripples like this. They're really cool. They're all over the place. There are also some bigger ripples. Now, just a reminder, Glendo is a state park, so you're not allowed to collect any rocks, fossils, wood, anything. So if you do come here and you want to look at some of these rocks, great. Take a lot of pictures. Do not collect anything, though. Don't say I didn't tell you. And here's some much larger ripples. These guys are, I don't know, about 6-7 inches wide from crest to crest. So a lot bigger wave creating these things, not those tiny little ripples. So that's interesting. We have an indication of standing water, maybe something not unlike this. These red bed facies are a lot different than lower down in the Permian part of the section. So again, we're in the Triassic, the early part of the Triassic. These are very regularly laminated muds, silts, and even some sandstones with ripples. Not a lot of trace fossils. If this is a marine environment, you expect to see all kinds of little traces. I'm going to show you some of them in the Jurassic. By the time the Jurassic comes around, this place is hopping with little benthic marine organisms. Right here in the Triassic, that seems to not be the case. We'll go through here and take a look and see if we find anything interesting, but it's looking pretty sparse in terms of trace fossils, and that probably tells us something important about the environment. So I'm looking at that ridge of sandstone. That's part of a coarsening upward succession that comes all the way around me, behind me, and continues. And it's striking in that the sandstone itself has little low-angle lamination, maybe some ripples in it. It sits on top of the siltstone, and it's part of an overall coarsening upward, thickening upward succession that's pretty typical of a deltaic system, or something that looks like a small delta, like a crevasse splay, maybe a levee, probably a delta. But if it was a marine delta, it would be chock full of little organisms, little burrowing organisms, surface feeding organisms, all kinds of things that would give us a strong indication that it's a marine deltaic system. This does not have anything like that. In fact, there's not really any trace fossils that I've seen at all. So we'll look on the promontory behind, see if maybe they're hiding there. This is the bedding plane view of one of those sandy beds. It's sort of corrugated and a mess and irregular, but no burrows, nothing clear. Maybe some indication of ripple crests. It's kind of hard to tell. It's kind of messed up. There's some ripple crests on that bed, it looks like. Sort of running that direction. But still no burrows. Look at the lamination in the sand. Really nice. Nice low angle, maybe a little undulatory lamination. And that just continues across the bed. So not hummocky, not swaley, just sort of low angle, maybe even parallel horizontal. You kind of get the sense that these are little episodic flows, almost like little event beds. And by the way, that's calcite growing on the fracture surface. So this crystalline texture is calcite or maybe quartz growing on where this rock was fractured. Sedimentary structures on the reddish sandstone. Nice ripple beds. You can see the individual crests of the ripples. Looks like some fracturing. It might be mud cracks, might be desiccation. So this might have been an ephemeral system. Looks like that almost could be a bivalve. That'd be interesting. I wonder if that is a bivalve cast. There's definitely things missing here that got weathered out, but that to me looks like a bivalve cast. So the shell is gone, but it left the impression. You know, that's where the valve would have attached to the other one. It's got that shape. I don't know. Something interesting. We've jumped up above that ridge down there, that progradational delta-looking ridge, and we're onto the light-colored, the kind of almost yellowish-colored body, and it's right behind me, fortunately, so we can take a look at it. It's another change in lithology. It doesn't have very clear lamination in it, it seems. It looks pretty massive. It's got that yellowish color at the top, which is probably telling us something about the geochemistry. Let's take a look and see what we think. So here we are up in that ochre facies, the kind of yellowish color, and look at this. There's mottled structures that look a lot like burrows or roots. And it looks like the red matrix was penetrated by something which was then filled in by this yellow material on top. Now, this is pretty common in soil systems. It's pretty common in marine systems too, but it's typical in soil where you get mottling like this of kind of reddish color, filled in by whatever sediment comes after it. And in this case, it could well be little roots, insects, things like that. The whole surface is totally bioturbated. Now, again, you can make the case that this is maybe a marine bioturbated unit, but there's no diagnostic marine traces. It's just these generic, massive shapes, which is pretty typical of something that's, like I say, a soil. And that yellowish color is interesting too. That's definitely not as oxidized. But, oh, look at this. There's little ripples in it. So yeah, we've got little ripple crests. There's lamination in the yellow sands. This is a very, very fine-grained sand, by the way, spilling into what appears to be a silty mudstone and filling in roots or burrows. Looking around at this maybe soil horizon, I just found this interesting feature here that's very large. It almost looks like a crayfish burrow cast. There's also all these other things, these little root-looking traces, or maybe insect traces, or crayfish traces. You know, while we're talking about soils and oxidation, it's maybe worth taking a moment and addressing the color. Reddish color in sediment is usually associated with oxidation that happens subaerially. And when I say usually associated, I mean people usually associate the two. It doesn't mean it's always the cause. You might have a reddish material because it was oxidized much, much later than it was deposited. In this case, it might have been oxidized years, decades, centuries after it was deposited. In other cases, it could be oxidized millions of years, billions of years after it was deposited, once the iron is exposed to oxygen. There's some papers that I've read, and in fact, even reviewed, where people have pointed to a reddish color in sediment and said, that means it's a paleosol, it's a soil, subaerially exposed. When there's zero evidence other than the color, you've got to start thinking, well, maybe there's other options for it being red. So generally, reddish rocks like this are a good indication of soil formation, but they're not something to hang your hat on and say, it's red, therefore soil. It's just something to keep in mind. This stuff looks like a soil. It seems to have trace fossils consistent with it being a soil. There's nothing to indicate it's marine or lacustrine in this interval. So there's other reasons for saying it's soil besides the red color. The red material down below, nothing in it says it's a soil. In fact, it looks like it's subaqueous. It looks like lacustrine deltas or shallow water deltas, but it's still red because the iron that was in that rock got oxidized at some point later when this rock was exposed to oxygen. When it was exactly, I couldn't tell you. Somebody who studies the geochemistry probably could. But be forewarned, pointing to a red rock and saying, therefore, it's a soil, it's not necessarily always the way to go. And now you know. This is a close-up of that possible crayfish burrow. It's got what appears to be a texture consistent with being scratched out by crayfish legs. It's certainly got the size of a crayfish burrow. It seems to go vertical. And here's some of these other little mottled structures that might be roots or crayfish burrows. And crayfish go back to the Permian, so it's maybe not a surprise that their burrows would be found in Triassic rocks. So what do we make of the Goose Egg Formation? Well, it lasted a long time. It lasted from the Permian to the Triassic. This is the Triassic. Traditionally, it's been interpreted as a shallow marine, sabga, tidal flat environment. If that was the case, there should be all kinds of marine animals burrowing in, crawling over and wiggling through the sediment. We don't see any of that. It's possible it's because it was a very hypersaline system. They couldn't tolerate it. It's possible there's all kinds of environmental restrictions, but they would at least, you would expect something. Maybe there's a clamshell, a bivalve, but they can be in fresh water. Overall, there's no real reason you would point to this and say it's got to be marine. It looks like standing water because we had carbonate down below. We had conglomerate of debris flows, which could be fluvial. It could be entering a basin with water in it. This succession behind me looks a lot like a deltaic succession. We've got shales and silts down below from the central basin of some body of water. Could be like that. And then where the small ephemeral streams came in, they were dumping deltaic sand, silts, coursing upward series like this. Now, I was thinking I was pretty clever when I came up with this, I don't know, a couple of days ago when I was looking through these rocks in detail. Turns out, as usual, somebody beat me to it. So there's a PhD dissertation by a fellow named Jonathan Knapp, or Knapp. Apologies if I'm butchering your name. It happens to me all the time, you can imagine. And he did his PhD in 2020 and suggested that the Goose Egg Formation, along with a lot of the Triassic red beds in Wyoming that traditionally have been interpreted as shallow marine sabkas, are in fact not shallow marine at all, but they're in fact lacustrine. So they happen in freshwater, not marine. That changes the way paleogeographic maps for the state are going to be drawn for the Triassic. And he had a variety of good indications to support his hypothesis that these are actually freshwater lakes. From what I'm seeing in the deposits here, where there's no marine trace fossils, no marine body fossils, there's a lot of aquatic sedimentary structures. There's ripples, there's coursing upward successions like in a delta, there's debris flows and some sort of carbonate or dolomite or something down there. That's typical of a lake basin, as well as a marine system, but the lack of marine trace fossils, to me, tilts it more towards a lake. So I totally agree with Dr. Knapp. I think the goose egg is probably best interpreted as a lacustrine system, big lacustrine system, but still not marine. This is pretty interesting, and just goes to show there's all kinds of stuff still to be discovered looking at these rocks. Some people tell you, we know all about that. Don't take it for granted. In this case, the lack of marine trace fossils is pretty telling. There's no reason they shouldn't be here. Sedimentation rates don't look like they were super high. We know at this time there was a diverse marine ichnofauna living all around the globe, so why wouldn't they be here? Unless you're not in a marine basin, you're in a lacustrine basin. All right, this has been a look at the Goose Egg Formation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll watch some of these other ones I got coming up. I'm going to be making videos in the Jurassic. I've got that overview of Glendo that I already showed you. Take a look. Let me know what you think. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. And remember to get out, look at some rocks, step away from your computer, get some fresh air, even if it's smoky, because these Canadian wildfires are going on right now. Make friends with the rocks. You'll be glad you did. I promise.